What if the hunter becomes the hunted? A dark forest, a chilling legend, and a detective who steps into the unknown only to uncover something far more sinister than she ever imagined. Stay with us as we unravel the horrifying tale of how the high country killer was finally caught. Or was he? The ending will leave you breathless. The fog rolled in thick, swallowing the moonlight. Trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the air. Detective Harper gripped her flashlight tightly. The beam danced across damp leaves and glinted off wet bark. Her boots squelched in the mud, the sound too loud in the suffocating quiet. A faint rustling came from up ahead. She froze, heart pounding in her chest. Breath visible in the cold air, she strained to listen. A crow's cry shattered the silence. Harper flinched, her hand brushing her holster instinctively. But it was just the wind stirring the branches. Or so she thought. The high country killer had eluded them for months. Each victim had been found deep in the forest, their bodies positioned with chilling precision. Tonight felt different. The trail had been fresh, leading her to this forgotten stretch of woods. A place where the air felt heavy and time seemed to stall. Her radio crackled faintly. "Harper, report. Do you see anything?" She hesitated before replying. "Nothing yet. Just the trees and shadows." The line went silent again. A sharp snap of a twig made her spin around. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the gnarled roots and underbrush. Her breath quickened. The forest felt alive, like it was watching her. Every rustle, every creak, set her nerves on edge. Then she saw it. A faint glimmer in the distance. Metal, catching the light. She moved cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the moss. The glimmer grew clearer, a trap, half buried in the dirt. Harper crouched to examine it. It was crude but effective, designed to maim. She felt the hairs on her neck rise. Someone had been here recently. The sound of a deep, ragged breath made her freeze. She slowly lifted her gaze. Eyes. Reflective, unblinking, just beyond the edge of her flashlight's reach. Her pulse thundered as a figure emerged, shrouded in shadow yet too close to miss. Something sharp glinted in their hand. She stood paralyzed, the weight of the forest closing in around her. Harper's fingers twitched toward her holster. Her breath came shallow, her body frozen in place. The figure stepped closer, slow and deliberate. The sound of their boots crushing the underbrush was deafening. The glint of metal revealed itself, a blade, long and jagged. Her flashlight trembled in her hand, the beam flickering. "Drop it," she commanded, her voice firm but trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, they tilted their head, as if amused. The shadows seemed to stretch behind them, their face obscured but their intent clear. In the stillness, Harper noticed the smell, a sickly sweet stench, metallic and clinging to the air. Her stomach turned. Then they moved. Fast. Harper's training kicked in. She drew her weapon, shouting, "Stop! Hands up!" But they were already darting sideways, disappearing into the dark. The forest exploded into motion. Branches snapped, leaves rustled. Her heart racing as she pursued. The flashlight beam swung wildly, catching fleeting glimpses of the figure ahead. A flash of movement, a shadow darting between trees. Her radio crackled again, but she ignored it. The chase consumed her. Each step deeper into the woods felt heavier, the air colder, thicker. A clearing opened before her, sudden and unexpected. She skidded to a halt, scanning the space. It was too quiet. Her flashlight caught something on the ground. A jacket, torn and blood-stained, lying in a heap. Her fingers brushed against it, and the warmth of fresh blood clung to her skin. A chill ran down her spine. The sound of breathing returned. Not her own, low and labored, just beyond the clearing. She swung the beam toward it, and saw them, kneeling by a tree, their hands stained red, hovering over something she couldn't yet see. "Police! Don't move," she yelled, weapon aimed. The figure turned slowly. Their face was pale, streaked with mud and something darker. But their eyes were wrong. Wide, unblinking, and filled with something she couldn't name. They smiled, not with joy, but with malice, slow and deliberate. And then Harper saw what lay at their feet. A body, lifeless and arranged like a macabre puzzle. Pieces missing, replaced with twigs and leaves. Harper's breath hitched. The killer rose, the blade still in hand. And then they lunged. Harper fired instinctively, the deafening crack splitting the night. The figure staggered but didn't fall. Their momentum sent them crashing into her. They grappled in the dirt, Harper's gun knocked from her grasp. She felt the blade slice through her jacket, grazing her arm. A sharp, burning pain spread, but adrenaline drowned it out. The flashlight tumbled, its beam casting wild, spinning shadows. She fought desperately, her hands clawing at their wrist, trying to keep the blade at bay. The killer's strength was inhuman, their face mere inches from hers. A mask of rage and something deeper madness. Harper's fingers found a rock, smooth and cold. She swung it upward with all her strength. The impact sent the killer reeling, the blade slipping from their grasp. They collapsed backward, gasping, clutching their temple. Harper scrambled for her flashlight, her hand brushing the butt of her gun instead. She seized it, aiming at the figure writhing on the ground. "Stay down," she screamed, voice hoarse. But they laughed. A guttural, rasping sound that chilled her to the core. Blood streamed down their face. Yet they rose, unsteady but defiant. The flashlight illuminated them fully now. Torn clothing, mud-caked hands, and a necklace of crude, twisted bones around their neck. Behind them, the body in the clearing seemed to shift. Harper's mind screamed it was impossible, but she swore she saw the chest rise and fall. The killer lunged again, a primal roar echoing through the forest. This time, Harper didn't hesitate. The shot rang out, and the figure crumpled mid-charge, their body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Silence descended. Harper's hands trembled, the weight of her gun almost unbearable. She stepped cautiously toward the killer, the flashlight trembling as it cast long shadows. Their body lay still, but their eyes remained open, staring at her with that same haunting intensity. Behind her, the radio crackled. "Harper? Harper, respond." Her breath hitched as she turned toward the body in the clearing. The air felt colder now, her skin prickling with dread. And then she heard it. A faint, wet gasp. The gasp sent shivers racing down Harper's spine. Her flashlight shook as she turned it toward the sound. The body on the ground, the victim was moving. A hand twitched, fingers curling into the damp soil. The chest rose again, slowly, unnaturally. Harper's mouth went dry. "Stay down," she barked at the killer's corpse. Her gun still trained on the lifeless figure, but her eyes flicked back to the victim. They were trying to sit up. "Help," the voice rasped, broken and wet. The word clawed its way from their throat. Their head tilted toward her, revealing sunken, hollow eyes. This wasn't possible. The victim's body was mutilated beyond saving. Blood soaked the forest floor, pooling beneath them. And yet they moved. "Help me," they repeated, their voice dragging like nails on stone. Harper stepped back, her pulse pounding in her ears. She dared a glance at the killer's corpse. It hadn't moved, but the eerie smile was still frozen on its face. The victim's hand reached out toward her, the fingers thin and claw-like. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if pulled by invisible strings. Harper's instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet felt rooted to the ground, her body paralyzed by the horrifying tableau before her. "Harper, respond." The voice on the radio was frantic now. She grabbed it with shaking hands, pressing the button. "This is Harper," she managed, her voice barely a whisper.
I
"I need backup."
now.
"What's your location?" She looked around, the forest closing in. She wasn't sure anymore. The trees seemed to shift and warp, their silhouettes twisting in the flickering light. I don't know," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I'm deep in the woods, past the ridge." "Just send someone." The radio went silent, static crackling faintly. A wet, gurgling sound drew her attention back to the victim. They were on their knees now, their head lolling unnaturally to one side. And then they smiled. It was the same smile as the killer. Wide, malicious, and entirely wrong. Harper staggered backward, the realization hitting her like a freight train. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't human. The victim's mouth opened, impossibly wide, a guttural growl echoing from deep within. The killer's body behind them twitched. Harper's flashlight flickered, the beam growing dim. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as the forest seemed to close in. Then everything went dark. The darkness was absolute, suffocating. Harper's breathing sounded unnaturally loud in her ears. She fumbled with the flashlight, slapping it in desperation.
Click.
The beam sputtered back to life, weak and uneven. The clearing was empty. The victim's body was gone. So was the killer's. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She spun in a slow circle, the light cutting through the dense blackness of the forest. "Come on," she whispered to herself. "Stay calm. Stay—" A loud crack split the silence, like a branch snapping underfoot. It was close. Too close. Her gun felt heavy in her hand. Its safety off, her finger hovering over the trigger. She aimed the flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. Just the trees, standing silent and still. But then she noticed the ground. The blood trail. It wasn't just smeared across the soil anymore. It was leading away into the trees. Each drop glistened under the light, forming a winding path deeper into the darkness. Harper's instinct screamed to stay put, to wait for backup. But she couldn't, not with whatever this was lurking out there. The trail led her deeper, the forest growing denser, the air colder. Her boots crunched softly on the leaves, her breaths fogging in the chill. Ahead, a faint noise emerged, a rhythmic, scraping sound. Metal on wood. The flashlight beam caught movement. A figure. It stood with its back to her, its shoulders hunched and trembling. The scraping grew louder as Harper approached. The metallic sound sent chills down her spine. "Turn around," she shouted, her voice echoing sharply in the stillness. The figure froze. Then, slowly, agonizingly, it began to turn. The flashlight caught its face, or what was left of it. Hollow eyes stared at her from a face twisted in unnatural angles. Skin peeled, shredded, yet moving. It was the victim. And they weren't alone. Behind them, shapes emerged from the shadows. Figures, pale and malformed, with wide, unblinking eyes. The killer was among them, his bloodied smile brighter than before. Harper took a step back, her gun trembling in her hands. The figures moved as one, their steps jerky, like puppets on strings. Her mind raced. Run or fight. The forest around her seemed to hum, the sound low and guttural, vibrating through her chest. Then, all at once, they lunged. The forest erupted into chaos. Harper fired blindly, the muzzle flash lighting up the clearing. The figures flinched but didn't fall. Each shot echoed, the sound swallowed quickly by the trees. Her flashlight swung wildly, catching glimpses of hollow faces, twisting limbs, and blood-streaked mouths. They were everywhere, closing in, their movements erratic and unnatural. Harper's heart raced, panic threatening to overwhelm her. The air felt heavier with each breath, thick with rot and decay. She stumbled backward, her boots slipping in the damp soil. The figures seemed to glide forward, their feet barely making a sound on the forest floor. "Stay back," she screamed, her voice hoarse, raw with terror. But they didn't stop. The killer stepped forward, leading them. His smile stretched unnaturally wide, revealing teeth sharp and blood-stained. "You found us," he said, his voice low and guttural, more growl than human. Harper's fingers fumbled with her last bullet. She loaded it with shaking hands, her eyes darting between the advancing figures. The killer's voice echoed again, but this time it wasn't just his. It was many voices, layered and dissonant, speaking in unison. "Welcome to the hunt." The words chilled her to the core. The air around her grew colder, her breath fogging as frost began to creep along the ground. The figures stopped suddenly, forming a circle around her. Harper turned in place, her gun aimed, her flashlight flickering. Their hollow eyes bored into her, watching, waiting. The killer tilted his head, as if studying her. Then he raised his hand, and the figures moved again. They surged forward as one, a mass of writhing limbs and snarling faces. Harper fired her last shot. The bullet struck the killer square in the chest. He staggered, blood oozing from the wound. But he laughed. The sound grew louder, spreading to the others, a cacophony of guttural, inhuman laughter. The flashlight flickered, once more, and then it died. In the pitch black, Harper felt their hands clawing at her, pulling her down into the cold, wet earth. The last thing she heard was her own scream, swallowed by the forest. Morning broke over the high country, casting pale light through the forest canopy. The once suffocating darkness had lifted, replaced by an eerie stillness. The search team moved carefully, their voices low, their radios crackling intermittently. "Harper? Can you hear us?" Detective Larson's voice carried through the trees, but there was no reply. They found her vehicle abandoned at the trailhead, signs of a struggle near the clearing. And then nothing. The forest seemed alive with a strange hum, a vibration that made the hairs on their necks rise. "Over here," one officer called, his voice laced with unease. They followed him to a small clearing, where the earth had been freshly disturbed. A mound of soil, dark and damp, marked the center of the space. The team hesitated. The air felt heavier here. Their breaths labored as they approached. Shovels were retrieved, and they began to dig. Each scoop of dirt revealed more a tattered jacket, a flashlight crushed and smeared with mud. Finally, a pale hand emerged, lifeless and cold. Detective Harper was pulled from the earth, her body battered but intact. Her eyes were closed, her face eerily serene despite the trauma she had endured. "Get the medics," Larson shouted, his voice shaking as they laid her out on the ground. But as they checked for a pulse, a chill ran through the group. Her hand twitched. "Wait," one medic said, his fingers trembling as he pressed them to her neck. "She's alive." The team erupted into motion, voices overlapping as they prepared to move her. But Harper's eyes shot open suddenly, wide and glassy. Her lips moved, forming words too faint to hear. Larson leaned in close, his ear nearly brushing her mouth. "Run," she whispered, her voice a hollow, rasping echo. Her body convulsed violently, her limbs twisting unnaturally. The search team stumbled back, their faces pale with terror as Harper let out a guttural, inhuman sound. And then she smiled, the same haunting smile that would haunt them forever. The forest watched, silent and unyielding, as the high country claimed another soul.